How long have you been 17?
I am a vampire, and you are mortal.
Hello and welcome to This Podcast Sucks.
The show where we take a bite out of the vampire genre.
We'll be following all manner of fanged fiends through the past 127 years of film and television.
From Nosferatu to Twilight, I'm your host, Tara.
And I'm your host, Elliott. And this week we'll be covering Mark of the Vampire.
Woo! I know you've been excited for this one.
Yes, I have been excited because this is a weird one in a few ways. Yes.
Yeah.
So to give this a little bit of an introduction, this film was released in 1935. It was directed by Tob Browning and written by Guy Endor and Bernard Schubert, and produced by Tob Browning and E.J. Mannix. Yeah, and this is our second Browning film that we've covered, I believe.
That surprised me so much when I saw he directed it, because I thought, after everything I heard about his behavior on the set of Dracula, that he would never be returning to this genre again. But, we all need a paycheck, so who knows?
Yeah, and in terms of on-set behavior, there seems to be a pattern. It might be safe to say that perhaps Tob Browning was not a team player.
Oh no! I can't wait for you to get into it.
Yes, yeah. Cool. Well, I feel like we've said this a lot, but this film has some really interesting similarities to last week's film as well, Vampire Bat.
Yeah, and I think we're also kind of in an interesting period with Hollywood film and the vampire film genre, and how we've kind of had the big names come out and set a precedence like Nosferatu and Dracula, but now we're kind of in the these things make money, so let's get them out there.
Yeah. So you're right, they have figured out that these things are popular, that these things can make money. So we are seeing some trends and patterns appear, and one of them is the presence of Lugosi. So this is our second film with Lugosi in it, and we have, I think, at least 3 more with Lugosi, where he either plays a vampire or Dracula himself.
Yeah. Well, I think he's only played Dracula on screen twice. Obviously in Dracula, and then the second time was in Abbott and Costello meets Frankenstein, I believe.
Fascinating. Okay. Because we're also, so maybe it isn't Lugosi, because I know that sneak peek, we have the son of Dracula and Dracula's daughter on our docket soon.
I mean, I could be wrong, but I could have sworn he's only actually played Dracula twice, but I guess we'll see.
Maybe those are just, maybe historians are like, the others were so bad that they haven't even like made it into the record or something.
or maybe that, he's not even in those films. They just talk about him off, he's a presence only spoken of.
Yes. Well, so for Mark of the Vampire, I think I'm trying to decide where to start with this, because a lot of what's most interesting about this film is the facts around it, in terms of its production history and where the story came from and the legacy of the film. So it's like, do we start there, or do we start with the movie itself? I think we should probably start with the movie itself, because it's another short one. It's an hour long. It's really interesting how short films used to be.
Yes, it is. And oh my God, I'm just picturing an audience now, or like an audience from the 1930s, like having to sit through Dune Part 2 or something, and just...
Oh, they would riot. They would actually riot.
They probably would. Well, like, first their brains would melt. Their brains would melt.
Yes, that too.
They would have no idea what's happening. Yeah, so do you want to you know far more about this than me, and I'm excited to hear about all the tea essentially and
Yes.
behind the scenes stuff.
Yes. All
But
the goss.
yeah, wherever you want to start. Do you want to start with just the what the movie's about?
The film is about a series of deaths and attacks by vampires that bring in the eminent expert Professor Zelen to the aid of Irina Boratin, who is about to be married. Her father, Sir Carol, died from complete blood loss with bite wounds on his neck, and it appears he may be one of the undead now plaguing the area. So this is this is a mystery film. This is more of the, it's described as a horror film, which I think is one of the things that we'll discuss, because I don't know that I would necessarily agree that this is a horror film. I think in some ways this is a bit more of a detective, like a
Yes.
mystery detective crime thriller,
Yeah. And
perhaps.
I think that was a popular genre around that time, the
Hmm.
detective film. So I would agree with that.
We love crime in our
We love a
media.
good crime.
Yes, we do. So this film stars Lionel Barrymore as Professor Zelen, Elizabeth Allen as Irina Boraton. I'll land on a pronunciation eventually.
Whatever's easiest.
Yes, Bella
That's how you should go
Lugosi.
about pronouncing names. Whatever's easiest.
Yes, just go for it. It's the commitment that counts. So Elizabeth Allen as Irina Boratin, Bela Lugosi as Count Mora, Lionel Atwill as Inspector Newman, Jean Hersholt as Baron Otto von Zinden, and Carol Borland as Luna, who is a really interesting character in a lot of ways. This is our first female vampire. This is our first woman vampire that we've covered so far.
Well,
Um,
actually, the first female vampire we covered was in Vampire.
oh my God, you're right. So true. You're right. That was a female vampire. I'm totally wrong. How could I forget that?
Well, I mean, was her presence as memorable as this one? I would
Yes.
say no,
Yeah.
so it's
This
fair.
is the first. She is vamping hard. I
She
think.
is vamping hard, and the whole time I'm watching her, I'm just kind of thinking like I'm curious to know like did she set the precedent here? Because I wouldn't be
Mhm.
surprised because I feel like so many subsequent depictions of or on-screen depictions of female vampires, it's like they have to have long black hair. They have to
Yeah.
be ghostly pale. They like
Hmm.
I can't think of too many like blonde or redhead or whatever hair color female vampires. So I
Yeah.
think like um yeah, her look is
Rosalie.
very yeah,
It's Rosalie.
Rosalie, and of course Bella thinks she's shallow and terrible because Bella's the brunette. So
Yeah, Esme is also blonde, and she likes Esme.
I think yeah, like Esme has like caramel hair. She says,
Yeah.
yeah,
Are they all
it's
blonde?
well, no, Alice has like the black
Okay.
pixie hair,
Yes.
which
Yeah.
she has very short hair, so that
Hmm.
means she's quirky.
Yeah,
So
she's quirky. Yeah, she's the weird
she's
one.
quirky, all right.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, her look is so distinct, and yeah, I would not be surprised at all if this is kind of what established or influenced all the majority of like subsequent or the
Hmm.
idea, I guess I should say,
Yeah.
of what a female vampire should look like.
Yeah, well, we'll get into it because you are correct that there are things about Luna's character that like casting a shadow sounds negative, and vampires don't have shadows.
True.
But there were things about this performance that influenced future films, and films at that time that were yet to be made. But one thing that's cool about Carol Borland, who played Luna, is that she had actually worked with Lugosi on the stage production of Dracula.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
and when she auditioned, she did not know that Lugosi was affiliated with the project.
Oh, that's
And
fun.
when she found out, she didn't tell the producers that they'd worked together before. Um,
They're just yeah, they're just gonna be like, wow, they seem really friendly on set. Or
or
I don't know.
the
I hope they had a
yeah.
good working relationship.
I think they had an okay working relationship. I think what was maybe more the case, and that we can get into it, was that they were incredibly impressed by how well she was able to emulate the body work and the body
Mm.
language of Lugosi.
Ooh.
And I think that she just kind of let
Yeah.
them believe that she was that good, and that she didn't really say anything about the fact that they toured together for like presumably months.
Interesting.
Yeah. There was Lionel Atwill, who plays Inspector Newman. I think that this is hilarious, and part of the whole gossip of it all. He was convicted of perjury and given 5 years of probation
What?
for allegedly hosting an orgy at his home,
Oh
which
my
led him to be
God.
blacklisted from Hollywood. Um,
That's wild. And,
yeah.
you know, Babylon's a wild movie, but it wasn't necessarily off the mark when it comes to the kinds of parties being thrown around that time. I
Yeah,
feel
and
like
it's really
so.
interesting because he was not the only person in this cast to go on to be blacklisted from the industry, because Elizabeth
Mm.
Allen, who plays Irina, was also blacklisted by MGM because she was a British actress. She didn't
Mm-hmm.
have much success. She came to America, was hoping to make it big. And she actually was quoted as considering Mark of the Vampire to be slumming it. And then MGM kept dropping her, promising her projects and then dropping her, and she sued them and won.
Good for
But
her.
she was never able to work in America again after that, really, and so she returned to Britain.
Yeah, I feel like an actor suing a Hollywood studio at that time period was
Yeah,
pretty much a death sentence for your career. Because
absolutely.
for our listeners who don't know, I'm not super well in depth informed about it, but actors at that time were under contract to specific studios, so they had to
Hmm.
make whatever films those studios were making. They couldn't go, I don't like the script or the story doesn't speak to me. Like they were
Hmm.
under contract to make a certain amount of films regardless. It's kind of like how it is now with the NFL and how sports players are signed to
Or
specific
Marvel.
teams. Yeah, I mean, yeah, so there's still like you can see
Yeah,
the that carry over a little bit, but
yeah.
yeah, so
Well,
so
that's helpful historical context because it explains why she sued in a way, because like she was contracted with MGM and they
mhm
kept promising her projects and dropping her at the very last minute.
mhm
So she was, if she was only allowed to work with Metro and they kept pulling the rug out from
right.
under her, like what's she supposed to do? So those are just some interesting little things. But in terms of the production, this film, so let me see. Well, it's one thing that's interesting about this film is that it's actually known more so for being an unnamed remake of a prior work of Browning's called London After Midnight. So a lot of the information
Oh,
when you look into this is that Mark of the Vampire is considered a remake of London After Midnight, even though they never mentioned any sort of relationship there. I think we'll hold back on that though. More to come on London After
oh,
Midnight.
no, I'm
Um,
excited to talk about that. That's a very
yeah.
famous lost silent film.
Yes, and we're gonna talk about how it was lost, and some of the we have lots of cataclysmic fires to discuss in our
Oh
future.
boy. Yes.
Yes, some really sad some sad things. But in terms of the actual production of the film, um, some goss on Tob Browning. Makeup artist Bill Tuttle gave the quote, "The crew and I didn't like to work for director Browning. We would try to escape being assigned to one of his productions because he would overwork us until we were ready to drop from exhaustion. He was ruthless. He was determined to get everything he could on film." Yeah, and
Oh, wow.
he also apparently had a nasty attitude where if he didn't like your performance for take, he would come up to the actor and kind of pretty rudely tell them what they'd done wrong. And then as he was walking away, he would mutter under his breath about how other actors he worked with would have done it better. And he would name drop them as well. Which is really, really unprofessional, to be honest.
Yeah, this podcast is making me like dislike Todd Browning more and more.
Yeah, it's like he's a really, really famous director, and then you learn on it, like, very minor, like, we've only heard about two productions of his, and we've had like pretty limited, quotes from people who were there, but everything that we've found so far is that he was a tyrant.
Yeah.
And that he really overworked people, gave very little, and expected quite a lot in return. So not really, just doesn't sound like he created a good environment either professionally or artistically.
No, not at all.
Yes. And so, another interesting thing about the production process for this film was that the ending of the film was hidden from all of the actors, including Lugosi, because Browning feared that it would negatively impact their performances. And we are also keeping the ending of the film hidden, by talking about it this way. So let's just, I guess now is a good place to just dive into the story so we can talk about this ending,
Let's do it.
all these secrets. Our film opens on a pretty classic, at this point, kind of creepy old woman in a creepy graveyard.
Yes. I loved the spooky graveyard and fog machine fog and everything, and it's just...
And there's like a
It
zombie
looks good.
hand or something that comes out of nowhere and grabs her.
Oh yeah, it's great.
Yeah. But this is a very familiar, we kind of tread some familiar ground here, where we have a very domestic moment of working women kind of, in that kind of space where it's like kind of like a large kind of back area where there's like cooking and washing happening. Someone's doing laundry.
Like a town square almost, kind of.
I think there's maybe a bit of that, but then we go inside a hotel, and I think we're in the kind of the kind of not backstage, back of house kind of region.
It's like it kind of has like a rustic inn vibe, and so already I feel like we're, like you said, we're getting kind of these familiar settings with the locals, or as they're called in these films, the peasants.
Someone literally calls them poor deluded creatures. Because
that's 1935 for you.
35. Yeah, exactly. It's very much the similar thing to Nosferatu and Dracula, and to a degree the Vampire Bat, all have this tension of like the provincial, ignorant, superstitious people, and like the educated, more empirical and rational kind of city folks. So like that we pretty immediately feel. But we have the introduction of a death. The man of the house, or Sir Carol, has died, and so we have a really cold bedside manner from, who is it, the detective who's like,
yes, Inspector Newman.
Yeah, Inspector Newman is like, a man has been killed. No cause for alarm. And one of the people collapses to the ground and is like very sad, and he says, "Get up."
Yeah, and just going back a little bit, I wrote in my notes, yes, big flappy bat.
Yes, there are bats. Yeah, we've got some great bats.
Todd Browning and his flappy bats. I think that appeared when an old woman was walking through the graveyard. We see this bat a lot. I think this is the most on-screen like time we've ever seen devoted to a singular bat.
You're correct. I think I have later, and we have a lot of bats throughout the film actually, because it
Hmm.
comes up in my notes much later, which is interesting because we just did the vampire bat. This film has way more bat than
Yeah.
vampire bat.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like in Vampire Bat, there's a lot of shots of like a collective of bats or a group
Hmm.
of bats, but I feel like this bat had its chance to shine, and
Yes,
its
yeah.
presence was a lot stronger.
We really feel we get the full 360 bat experience with this film.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so going back to what you were saying with the inspector being very cold and detached about this murder, was this isn't at the end anymore. This is at the house, right?
I think so. I mean, one of the things that we've talked a bit about is that we have not really gotten films have little to no connective tissue at this
Mm-hmm.
stage,
Yeah.
where we don't really get that many the idea of B-roll of establishing shots and
Right.
interior shots that kind of give you sense of the space,
Mm-hmm.
entrances and exits to rooms and buildings and locations, those things are very thin on the ground. We have very few scenes where we just get a sense of who characters are. There's a lot of times where you don't find out who someone is until several minutes into a scene.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that sometimes it's there are a couple of the films I've kind of struggled to keep track of the locations. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we do move to the house because I think um we meet the daughter, right? We meet
Yes.
Irina.
Um, yes, so beforehand, I think at the house when the inspector is speaking with the doctor, and the doctor,
Yes.
I believe, is the one to say, "This is a vampire," he
Hmm.
says, and I quote, "for the cause of death, real." And they're all the inspector's very much, I am a man of science, and what's this about vampires? And I just wrote in my notes, do neck holes mean nothing in these films?
That it's really funny because in my notes I find it so charming that we're at this stage of culture where people don't even know what vampires are. Films
Mm-hmm.
can't get away with that now.
Yeah.
You can have
Oh, yeah,
vampire
no.
films now, you can have some quibbling about the lore, you can kind of put your own spin on how vampires are created, but you are just not going to get away with a character asking what a vampire is, or it's just not going to happen. So I think it's
Right.
very sweet in a way that
Mm-hmm.
people haven't heard of the two puncture wounds on the
Yeah, just
neck.
don't set your film in the modern day.
Yeah, just
Uh,
stop making films. Just make all your vampire films
mm,
set before the 1930s. That will solve all of your
that
problems.
yeah, that's a whole other very big discussion that can be had, which is how much early Hollywood films did not give a shit about historical accuracy if they
Hmm.
did set their films in the past, especially with costumes and things like that. But
Hmm.
like I said, another
Yeah.
story for another day.
Well, there's also very little commitment to some of the other elements of realism that we would pay a lot more attention to now. Like, for example, where films are set, because we've had a few films that are set in Germany, but all of the characters have British accents and English
Yeah.
names.
Oh, I mean, we're still doing that. Like,
Yes,
we're
this
still
film
setting
is.
films. Like, I just watched Napoleon recently with Joaquin Phoenix. Like, everyone else having a British accent, and Joaquin Phoenix comes in like, "I'm a great man, and I will," and it's just, I will put, I will push their forward. Like, it's just like his way of talking. Like,
No
I felt
one
like
has a French accent in Napoleon.
no, and here's the thing, I'm a
What?
little it's an artistic choice that I'm conflicted about, because on the one hand, sometimes I do agree that it is distracting when actors try to do accents. Milos Forman's Amadeus, which is a great film. That's like an
I love
objectively great.
Amadeus.
Amadeus
Yeah.
is fantastic. No one's doing an accent in that movie, and it's not a I mean, it takes place in Vienna, and you don't really notice. I
Uh
mean,
huh.
it's not a distractor in any way. But with Napoleon, it's like what about one of the most famous French figures in all of history.
Yeah.
And it runs into the Les Mis musical problem a bit, where it's, we're dealing with very specifically French topics, things that are, part of French history, and everyone is like speaking with a British or Cockney accent. So it's like
Um,
there's a little bit of
yeah.
some dissonance there.
Yeah, it's definitely now I guess I'm thinking of like The Great, which is about
Mm.
Russia and everyone
Yeah,
has like a
that's a
pretty.
British.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or just like a not no accent at all, like more of an American accent. I think some of the characters might even have. I can't see. It's like when you start to watch enough British media, and you
Hmm.
can't tell the difference between American and British accents anymore.
Well,
Um,
yeah, I think it works in The Great because one, Elle
mhm,
Fanning can do a very good British accent,
yeah,
and two, I think we're
it's so
it, it,
anachronistic.
exactly, that's such a good way of putting it. It is so anachronistic. It works.
Yeah.
And I think we as an audience would be, again, I think I lean more towards the don't have your cast do accents because I think it just
hmm
ends up being distracting.
That's yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, I mean, but it's like even just that idea of what counts as realism is gonna, in a lot of ways, it's gonna be as we're seeing, kind of site specific to the moment in history, and that's also even gonna be viewer to viewer specific because like
Hmm.
I know we've talked about how you and my mom are both very aware of whether or not babies are the right age in
When they're
movies.
bored on film.
Yeah, when a
Yeah.
baby is born and then it's like 9 months old. I can't, like, I could not age a baby if you put a gun to my head. So that's a kind of realism that like doesn't even matter to me at all.
Hmm.
But then there are other things where I'm like, no, that's wrong. That's just
Yeah,
not
and
right.
it like totally goes over my head, and you bring it up, and I go, whoa, I did not even know that or think about that.
Yeah, so it's, I think that's one of those things, like so many aspects of film, it's because it's an art and because it's a fantasy. It's really difficult to say that there's ever like a right or a wrong way to do something. Um,
Hmm.
but anyway, Mark of the Vampire. So what's happened is we've had a series of deaths. At this point in the film, we've had a series of deaths. People have no blood, and then this wealthy man, Sir Carol, has died. And his young, beautiful, soon to be wed daughter is distraught about this. There's some conversations about, like what could have happened, and some of the people are like pretty dismissive of this whole vampire idea. And we're introduced to her, um, kind of, let's call him a well-meaning idiot is what I have in my notes.
I had no idea who he was because I think his name was, it sounded like an uncommon name
Fedor.
for a
Fedor?
man. Fedor?
F
Fedra? I
E
think it's
D O
Fedor.
R. Fedor. Let's go with.
Fedor. I thought it was a kind of uncommon sounding name at the
hmm
time, but I was just confused. At first I thought because she was saying father's dead, I was like, is that her brother?
Yeah, I
And
was also like, okay.
again, we run into this, run into this early film problem like with Vampire where it's just like we don't need to introduce people in a context or anything.
Yeah,
It's again, it's very stage like. It's very
yeah,
theatrical how characters kind of come on screen. There you are.
yeah.
And
And I think
um,
what adds to the confusion is that there's a few scenes where Fedor is there but doesn't say anything. Like I think maybe like so sometimes it's like, oh, that guy who was in the background of that scene and never talked. That happened a lot in the Vampire Bat. There were a lot of scenes where there were five people but only
well,
two ever spoke.
yeah, like at the end where we find out who the scientist or doctor has been mind controlling, and we're just like, who is this guy?
Emil,
Like, of
who
course.
are
Oh,
you, Emil?
how could I forget Emil?
um, yes, of course. So how could you forget Fedor,
I'm sorry
her
because
loving fiance?
Fedor is a Jonathan with slightly more lines. He is still a
Yes,
sexy lamp.
he is a sexy lamp. So we have a scene in the carriage. And this was another thing where I was like, because they're talking and there's all these people dancing, and he's like, why? Like, look at the peasants dance. Are you not amused? And she's
I know, and she just like starts crying, and he's like, "What's the matter?" And I'm like, "What is it with these men not recognizing that their female love interests like lose significant people in their
yeah,
lives?" And the next day, they're just like, "Come on, what are you
yeah.
so upset about?"
Yeah, well, it's like
Um,
there's not much room for grief. But I had a similar experience of this scene where he's like, well, like let the festivities, enjoy the festivities, and she's talking about her father, and to me,
yeah,
I was like, this just happened. Like he is really
right,
not being sympathetic. It turns
yeah.
out that that scene was actually, it was a time jump forward of a full year.
Oh, okay, because they made that clear in the movie.
Yes, it doesn't that doesn't get explained until several minutes later because
I
I
guess
had
I
in my
missed that.
notes it feels like we've had some sort of passage of time, and then I have a sub bullet
Mm.
that says it was a full year. It just took
What?
several
Oh
minutes
my
for that to
God.
get explained. Um
Okay, again, I
yeah.
kind of missing the classic 1 year later title card appearing. But
Yeah, we are. And I mean it's also, I mean that's also a stylistic thing because now it's kind of a bit of a faux pas, or it feels a bit clumsy to have the first
mm,
few minutes of a film and then to jump forward a big amount of
yeah,
time where it's like set
that's
the movie where the story is,
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I was just gonna say I really liked, I forget the actress's name, but in the carriage scene, I thought, she did a really good job at conveying this, her
Mhm.
sense of loss felt palpable when she
Yeah.
was talking about her father. And yeah, gosh, you don't know what you lost, Metro, with Coldwood Mare, with this
Yeah.
actor.
Yeah. They fumbled the bag on Elizabeth.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so and then we get a cat.
Kitty.
We get a nice cat. And so yeah, so at this point I have also written down that it feels like we are like speed running the first two acts of Dracula. Like we are really,
Yeah.
really hitting some of these very familiar plot beats, but like at warp speed, you know?
Oh yeah, because now the what is the main female character's name? It is, hold
Irina.
on. Irina, because now
Yeah.
Irina is living with I guess a male family member or uncle, I believe.
Hmm.
It's just funny because he said, I wrote down the quote where he says, "I being her guardian," and I'm like, this
Uh-huh.
woman is in her 20s. But
I mean, it's
yeah,
the we're still 40 years away from women having bank accounts at this point.
yeah, I know. That's
It's just crazy to
so
think about.
yeah. But she's living with him now.
Yes, and I believe that that is Baron Otto von Zinden.
There's like at least three or four men in this movie who have
There's
very similar job
Yeah,
titles, I feel
and
like.
they all dress the
They all
same
look the same, they
way
all
in
dress
these
the
like
same.
plaid
Well,
three-piece
now
suits.
whenever, yeah, I'll remember Lionel Atwell now.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, with the with his orgy. Yes. Baron Otto von Zinden, is the one who is like pro it was a vampire who did it. He's the one who's
Hmm.
like, I think that this was vampires.
Hmm.
And so Detective Newman is the one who's like, meh, that's not science. That was a very
How can
silly
vampire
noise.
if science?
Yeah, how can vampire if science? That is a formula that you have identified that will persist through the next 90 years of movies.
Oh my gosh. But yes, so getting back to the
This is
film, sorry, we're going
we
on so
have
many tangents.
we have gone on so many tangents. This
We have.
film feels like a big tangent though. I have
It
to
really does
say.
until like the plot kicks in the last 10 minutes.
Yeah, like actually the last 10 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but I mean, we get an inciting incident because I think this is when we get our first vampire attack because
Mhm.
Fedor
It's called Fedor.
appears. call him Faye. Yeah.
Yes, Faye. It gives him some like some je ne sais quoi. Like
Yes,
some...
I love that. Yeah, so Faye appears disheveled, right? And this is when he says he was struck near a spooky castle.
Oh yes, yeah, he's like stumbling. He says that he feels very weak, that he passed
Mm,
out, that it took him, I think, a few hours to get strong enough to make it back.
mm,
Yes,
mm-hmm.
and so this is when the idea of like there being a vampire starts to gain some traction. So we get introduced to Luna at this point. Um,
Mm. The
and
female vampire.
yes, the female vampire. So well,
Oh,
okay, so we get introduced to Luna, and I don't know if her like the implication there I think is like a father daughter, a little bit of it's a
yes.
father daughter thing.
That's what I said. Father-daughter vampire team. Let's go.
Yes, yeah, it's a family business, you know. Um,
But yeah, so we see Bela Lugosi again, and
yeah,
the shot of them when we first see them inside the castle is so great. Again,
yeah,
it's very much like Dracula, where we get these kind of introductory shots of vampires, and it's just very quiet, and they're moving just very slowly.
yeah.
And he has a noticeable wound on the side of his
Yes, he
head,
does. Yeah.
because I think he's also supposed to be kind of like a ghost, and that's how he was killed.
We'll
It's
talk
not
about that because there's some
yeah.
interesting theories about that wound on his head. It's never explained within the film but he
Oh,
has a
okay.
very noticeable like blood stain.
Yes. Yes,
Um
and she's walking in front with this beautiful, like white, long kind of gauze
mhm.
gown, long sleeves, like long waist length black hair, very
Yeah.
striking makeup, very pale. Just like we were saying earlier, kind of like what we think of now when we think of like a female vampire.
Yes.
And yeah, there's a great shot of them going down the staircase with the
Mhm.
cobwebs and the
Yeah.
candelabra, and it's like, good shot.
Yes, and there's some discussion. We got implication that they have like a plan, and they're kind of like talking about. It's pretty vague, but they'll talk about like doing things together.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I
Yes.
wrote the as they walk out of the castle, the daughter goes off into the mist, and
Hmm.
I think one of the a woman from the town, or a woman that's visiting the town, and her husband are in a carriage or
Yes.
something, and I and she screams when she sees her, and I just wrote, oh no, she saw a goth.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, that's a really, really funny moment because I think that Luna says, I've been a good girl all my life, which is a
Mm-hmm.
really funny thing, I think, to say.
Mm-hmm.
To in this moment where they're like frightened of her and she's like, don't worry, I've been a good girl all my life.
Oh, I don't
Yeah,
know
and
what
it
that
feel
means.
yeah, exactly. And it's possibly a little saucy because then there's like we've talked a lot. There's a lot of these films have subtext that can be read in a lot of different ways because then we have a scene where Irina kind of seduces or entrances Luna
Yes.
seduces or entrances, however you want to see it, Irina through a window, and Irina like comes out onto
Yes.
the patio and
Let's.
she
Yeah.
sinks to her knees and
Yeah,
she's
or
like on
in a
her
chair.
knees waiting for Luna to like, and Luna does the like you're describing, this really slow walk up to her, and in the background like Lugosi, like not Dracula, he's watching and he has this
Mm-hmm.
really intense like look of satisfaction on his face. um
Yeah, it's like it's queer, it's
yeah,
kinky,
it
and
is kinky. It is a little kinky.
it's like Lugosi likes to watch. But
Yeah, and just the because we've yeah, and I think is this the first time that we see a woman feed on another woman? It's
I
not.
believe
Or is
it
it?
is. I
Well,
believe so. I don't
okay.
believe we saw it happen on screen in Vampire, even
Okay.
though there was a
Yeah.
female vampire. But yes, I think I did put that in my notes
Okay.
that, this is like again that domestic space being kind of invaded, and
Hmm.
that undertone of like sexuality,
Yeah.
or coming to the forefront of like this very kind of buttoned up or oppressed environment, but it's two women.
It is
And
two women, and it's like, and it's very clear. Like, there's no kind of, oh, I wonder what's going on. And yeah, and just the body language of it, I think
mm,
is, the fact that she gets down on her knees, I think is
mm,
really, because we've
yeah,
seen a lot of things where it's like someone is in a chair and then the vampire kind of leans over them. We've had a few moments in a
yeah,
bed. Um, but it's
mm-hmm,
definitely, I think it's the most, for lack of a better term, it's the most like submissive posture that we've seen a
mm-hmm,
victim take.
mm-hmm,
Short of just like, being unconscious on the ground, which is obviously
mm-hmm.
like the most vulnerable. But that's like not something that the person is like, they've passed out. We get that moment. And then I think that she's kind of discovered, and they put her to bed because she's, unwell. Um, and
Yeah, I think. Oh, God.
well, I just have in my, it's so funny, like when I look back at my notes, the things that I like latch onto, because
Mm-hmm.
I have like a whole like multiple sentence thing about like an absurd set piece that's in her bedroom. It's like, it looks like almost like one of those columns from a Cheesecake Factory, but
What?
even bigger. It takes up like half the room.
Oh my.
Um,
I Okay, I need to see this again because I don't remember that. That's so
It's really,
interesting.
I mean, it's
How you
literally
notice
like
that?
the background of the shot. It's not what you're supposed to be paying attention to. But once I
Yeah,
noticed it, I was like, what is that? Like, whose house looks like this?
it wasn't a house. It was a cheesecake factory.
Yeah,
They
of
just
course.
they couldn't get like the rights, so they
They,
just
they couldn't get the rights.
they couldn't
Um,
show the exterior of the cheesecake factory. So
yes. All right, so this is the point at which we really start talking about, we get into the
yes, well,
facts
this
here.
is yeah the facts, and of course it's only the men because as they say, excuse us, poor ill woman, like while we
Mhm.
discuss, if it's actually a vampire.
Yes, yeah. They send her off to bed with the maid.
Yeah, they do that a lot in
Yeah.
these early vampire films.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
do. Yeah. Yeah, it's very like, it is very like send is shooing the child away.
Oh
Sort
yeah.
of. Yeah. And the maid is actually really funny. Like the
Yeah.
maid kind of has a lot of, one thing that we haven't talked about is like the comedy of this film. Some
Yeah.
critics look back on this film as like a satire, and as a
I love
comedic
that.
film. Yeah.
I love that because I think I actually thus far in these films I laughed a fair bit at
Hmm.
this one, I think. Although nothing is ever going to top Lionel Atwell taking out the pill bottle in the vampire bat and it just has the huge label poison.
Poison.
That broke me.
Yes. Yeah.
But I love that interpretation of this film being a satire. And yeah, we'll talk about that more when we finish recapping the film, I think.
Yes. Yeah. So we have a conversation about like what vampires are. I think they read from like a French monograph or something. Maybe that was the vampire bat.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Um, but so there's this quote that I really liked that I pulled out where they say that vampires are, they describe it as a dead alive creature spit up from the grave, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is like very
And
dramatic.
yes, and a in the vampires a pestilence that grows, so kind of continuing that connection between vampirism and disease,
Hmm.
and you spread vampirism like a plague,
Yes.
kind of.
Yeah. I also like that we have this detail of, instead of wolf's bane, we have bat thorn.
Okay, thank you. I write that later. That's like a few bullet points down, but I just write what is Batthorn because I listen. I'm a Vampire Diaries girly. I grew up on Vervain.
Oh, okay, yes.
Yeah, so I know Vervain. I know Wolfsbane. And Crucifix is your classic. What you little things to ward off a vampire. I've
But
never heard of
Batthorn,
Batthorn.
yeah.
Yeah,
I think they just wanted to be original. I think they wanted to have their own thing going for them. So they were like,
yeah,
Wolfsbane Batthorn. Like, because that to me feels like a very transparent trend. Like, wolf, bat, like Bane, Thorn. You know,
Yeah.
it's like
Hmm.
like kind of creepy animal, creepy supernatural animal, and then like plant that we have negative associate, because Bane is like there's other plants that end in the suffix
Yeah.
Bane.
Bane.
Yeah,
Bane. Yeah. Does it grow in the dark?
I don't
I-
know. It could
oh,
also
I'm sorry.
be.
That like I'm referring to Bane from The Dark
Oh
Knight Rises.
yes, yes.
That was
What
so
does he
bad.
say?
I'm
He's
so
like,
sorry. I was
where
raised in the
it's
dark. Or
yes, yeah. Where he
was
where
born in the
yeah,
dark.
where he's like, you were trained in the dark. I was born in the
Oh
dark.
my god,
Yeah,
I'm so
something.
sorry. That's my
Yeah.
only association when I hear Bane.
No, that's a good. I was also thinking about Tom Hardy.
We're always thinking about Tom
Yes,
Hardy.
there's always at least a couple brain cells devoted to Tom Hardy in this brain, at least.
Absolutely, yes. This brings well.
We
Oh
should
my
do
god, Tom
Venom.
Hardy. I remember when we watched Venom. Yes, I would love to do Venom. And now I'm just thinking of like Tom Hardy as a vampire, but I think the closest we'll ever get to like is when he played the bad guy in Star Trek Nemesis, and it almost destroyed his career.
Wow, I didn't even
Yes.
remember. Wow, deep
He would
cut.
like us not to
Yes,
remember. He
he's
would
like,
like us
please
to
forget.
don't remember. Yes, no, that's a whole thing, but the look is it's very like Xenobite from Hellraiser. It's like full like
Ooh,
long black leather, high
uh-huh.
collar, shaved head.
Love it.
He's doing something with it, you know. He's not bored. I don't think he was bored in that film, so
You
I give him
can,
props for that.
yeah, you can always trust Tom Hardy to do something. I've never seen a Tom Hardy film where he really did nothing with it.
Yeah.
Where
Yeah,
he
exactly.
is always putting in an effort. He's similar to Nicolas Cage in that way, because people make
Yeah.
fun of Nicolas Cage, but Nicolas Cage gives 150% to every single performance.
He absolutely does. And I think it's important to know that at least my impression is that he's very self aware about it because I watched The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent recently where he's playing
Oh,
himself
yeah.
and Pedro Pascal's like the big fan that flies him
Hmm.
out to like visit and it's so funny and it really leans into like the Nick Cage memes, how
Hmm.
Nick Cage sees himself as an actor and his method and like it's
Very
clear this
cool.
man has no problem like making fun of this image
Yeah.
of himself.
And he's
So
also a true cinephile. Like, from
yes.
what I've heard, he
Well,
is
that's
like,
yeah, that's the joke in the movie is that his daughter feels distant from him because he only wants to like watch the movies he likes with her, and he's like, "You didn't like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari?"
yeah, but apparently in interviews when they're like, "What's your favorite movie?" he'll list something, some black and white film that no
Yeah.
one's ever heard of, or some silent film that no one's ever heard of.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, but
um, sorry,
returning,
we're such
returning.
a tangent podcast.
No, I am terrible. This is the one. See, I'm the one who's kind of chauffeuring us through this movie, and we can blame it on me. I'm being a terrible
No,
guide right
no,
now
you're not. I blame it on this movie
of
because
this movie.
yes, this movie's a lot of things, but like the plot is like, can we get to it, please?
Yes,
And we
this
do. And like I
movie.
said,
Yeah,
last 10 minutes.
this movie is a lot of things. It's possible that it's not good and not interesting.
That's what, yeah.
um, that
It's
might be harsh. I think it is interesting.
yeah, yeah. I think it does some things in an interesting way. Well, it introduces stuff. I have to appreciate that it introduces like our first kind of real on-screen female vampire
Yes.
and
Yeah.
like all of that.
Girls can
But
kill too.
yeah, girls can have hobbies. And so so wait, oh my god, where are we in this
We so
plot?
we
Are they still
we're
just like standing around being like, it's a vampire?
they are so they are still standing around talking about what vampires are and how they work. We have the line "dead alive creatures spit up from the
Mm-hmm.
grave." We have Batthorn. We also have the line "each victim that it kills itself becomes a vampire." I flag that one because I'm really curious to see when the difference between like draining and turning comes
Mm.
into the vampire genre, because now we very much have the idea that vampires can drink some blood from a person, drain a person of all their blood and kill them, and then turn a victim into a vampire, and that those are three separate things. But so far we've really only had that, like, if you are killed by a vampire, you are then a vampire yourself.
Yes, there's not just they drink all their blood and they're dead.
Yes. And then another line, I think this is maybe like one of the strongest lines in the film in general, is just in terms of like the themes of the vampire genre, like, because obviously with horror and with vampires, like, mortality and death comes up a lot. So
Yep.
there's this line, there's nothing terrible about death, but to live on after death, a soul earthbound, a vampire, you don't wish any such fate for your beloved. And I believe that that is Zelen talking to Fedor. So I thought that was a really beautiful line, and it's a really interesting, because this is a tension that we've already talked about in prior episodes, and that will continue to come up again and again, is whether or not it is good to die. You know.
Yeah. And this at this point in history with these films, it's very much a yes, it's natural to die. It is not a
Mhm,
good thing to live on in an
mhm,
unnatural capacity after that.
mhm. And the closer we get to this contemporary moment, 2024, the more we see characters who are like, dying sucks, I don't want to die.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I think that that's just like a big cultural shift.
Yeah.
And the way that we portray death on screen has changed a lot over
Mm.
the 120, almost 130 years of film history that we have. um
Mm-hmm.
so now we start, kind of like, the plot starts kicking in. We have a lot of moments of people getting startled from behind and screaming and stuff. We have a break-in. We have, like, the maid is screaming, the
That's
maid and
right.
the butler are screaming, and the men come up the stairs and they're like, "What's going on?" And then
Um,
it's funny because there's a flashback. We have a flashback to something that happened 90 seconds prior. Um, where
oh
we
my
actually have a
god.
pretty lovely shot of
Yeah.
Lugosi coming in through the window as a bat.
Yes. In
And
my notes
then,
I say,
yeah.
"Oh shit, Bela."
Yes, there he is.
So,
Yeah. And
yeah,
another
that was a
bat
nice
moment.
shot. Yes, there's been so many again shots of my big old flappy bat and
Yeah.
yeah, but this time I think um well actually we'll get into it later when we see a really cool effect of
Hmm.
the vampire bat turning into Elliot. I'm sorry, I'm just now realizing my brain is breaking from the fact that I just brought up this moment later in the film, but then there's also the ending of the movie. So we'll talk about that.
We'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there. Sorry. As you were saying.
Well, so we have this moment, and then they continue, and then they go back to discussing what's to be done about this, because at this point, like, everyone has been convinced that this is vampires. We gotta kill these vampires. And so then it becomes where they're talking about, how do we do this? They have to be beheaded, and then a
Hmm.
sprig of bat thorn must be stuffed in the wound. So this is a bit of a, it's kind of gross, but this is a bit of a diversion from the idea of staking a vampire through the heart. We have to have a beheading, which
Hmm.
feels a bit more zombie-like for audiences today.
It does, but I think that's also pretty that's part of the traditional like vampire lore of how to defeat them. I thought decapitation was pretty standard in
I
terms of like
guess, yeah.
the vampire mythos. I could
Yeah.
be wrong, but
No, I think it's not unheard of. I think that it's just like the bread and butter is really a stake through the heart, you
oh
know.
yeah.
Um yes, and so then we had this really lovely shot of Luna watching Irina through the window. Um and that was this film unfortunately did not necessarily impress me so much on the cinematography editing end of things.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a few films where, like, yeah, maybe the plot wasn't so great, but there's been some really beautiful cinematography. I did not necessarily feel that way about this film. So, oh, I'm looking at my notes, and I just see the bullet. I see really beautiful shot of Luna watching Irina through the window. And then I have those bitches shot at a bat.
Those animals.
How could
Not
they
my,
do that?
not daddy.
Yeah, exactly. So they tried to shoot a bat, and then I guess one of them was like, "You can't kill a vampire in bat form, you fool."
Obviously, you idiot.
Yes, and so at this point, everyone has like gone to the abandoned estate of Sir Carol, and oh my god, I forgot to mention that this whole time we've had a couple moments where Irina has seen what she believes to be the vampiric version or like the resurrected body of her father, like her father's corpse. So she's kind of seen him playing piano, and then they go and the dust is there's like something up where they're like, oh look, like he couldn't have been here. And so then they're all of them, Newman, Detective Newman, and then Irina and Fedor, and then Zindin. Yes, okay. So we've got, see, this is where it gets, they need to name people better. Because
Yes,
we have Detective Newman, we have Fedor and Irina, and then we have Baron Otto von Zindin, who Irina is living with. He's the kind of guy who's like, I
Right.
am the guardian.
Yeah.
And then we have Professor Zelen, who is the expert on vampires who showed up and was like trying to convince at the
Yeah,
beginning of the film,
he's
convince
kind
Newman.
of like
Yeah.
he's kind of like the Van Helsing
Yes.
insert character.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And at this point, has Bela and the vampire daughter taken Irina to the castle at this point?
Actually, yeah, I think you're right. I think that
So
she's been
have
captured and tied up.
taken.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and you see kind of the ghosts of their victims, and this is when we get that cool effect of the vampire or the bat flying in, and it transforms into the vampire girl.
Yeah. That was a great moment.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have a really lovely, there's another kind of actually kind of creepy moment that I really liked where like everyone's kind of exploring around the castle, and Zelen and Zindin, am I getting that right? Zelen and Zindin? Yes, Zelen and Zindin
But
are alone
Zelen's
in the basement, and Baron Otto and Zelen are alone in the basement, and they have a candle, and they're just standing in this doorway by this staircase, and their candle gets blown out, and then and when they relight the candle, Luna and the other vampire are there watching them in the background, and so that was kind of like a fun little like creepy and very classic horror moment. Like it's one of the most common types of devices in terms of like the mise en scène in horror films is that you leave an empty background that's like waiting for the monster, waiting for the spray of blood, waiting for the horrific thing. So it's really fun to just kind of see those like classic kind of horror moments where like you think that what you're supposed to be paying attention to is the foreground, and then the actually interesting thing is happening in the background. Yes. So this is where I guess this is when the jig is up. Because drum roll please. They're not vampires. They're actors. Whoa. I know. Mind blown. Exactly. So they kidnap Irina and they get her into their room, and and she turns to them and she's like, I just can't do it. I can't do it anymore.
Oh, he looks too much like father.
Yes, this act has gone on too far. And, you know, that she's struggling with this because she has actually lost her father. So they found this look-alike guy. And so it turns out that they have suspected Baron Otto this whole time. And that they have been trying to get evidence to arrest him, but they have largely been unsuccessful because remember, it's been a whole year. And so she's like, wants to back out. She's tired. It's very stressful for her, like pretending that her father is still alive when he's not. And so there's this absurd conversation where one of them says to her, our vampire scheme was so simple, so certain to succeed.
It's like, what are you talking about?
It is the least simple and most unlikely to succeed ruse I've ever heard.
You are all idiots, and you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, you are all fools. So it's just so silly. It's just so silly. And so it's like, of course, all of this work that I think has been in some ways successful to establish this creepy father-daughter vampire duo. The odd dynamic between Luna and Irina. Like they did all this work and now it's just like, well, they're paid actors, which is funny because they are paid actors. But so it's like, it's the layers where they're actors playing vampires who are playing actors playing vampires.
And I guess, you know, they're such good actors. Apparently they can transform into bats and then transform back into humans.
You know, you're so, because the fact that the butler and the maid were not in on this scheme is a massive plot hole. Because,
but just like the scene itself of the woman, like the huge effect of the bat turning, like what? And it wasn't even in a context where you would have to have people think that she was a vampire because it was at the castle with all the actors. Like,
and also did Fedor then pretend to have gotten attacked and like, because he was like, I thought he was genuinely injured, or was he just faking it?
I don't know. I think Fedor was just an idiot, so
he just tripped and fell and hit his head and then was like, I guess I got attacked by vampires.
Wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, no, I like to believe Fedor had no idea what was going on and he's just that helpless.
Just that helpless. Okay, so this conversation with Irina happens. The whole thing is revealed. So then we cut back to Zelen and Baron Otto. And so Zelen, as we've established, is our like vampire aficionado, and Baron Otto von Zinden is the guardian. And so he hypnotizes Zelen, Professor Zelen. And what I have to say is a pretty half-assed hypnosis. Like, Zelen is deeply impressionable that this works on him. I think Otto just kind of moves the candle back and forth in front of his face, and he's like,
that's all you need. And
and he's like, oh, like, aren't you feeling like disorientated? And he's like, yeah, I am. Wait, no, I got it wrong. I'm so sorry. I flipped it. Zelen hypnotizes the Baron.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Zelen hypnotizes the Baron. It's still very silly where he just kind of moves the candle back and forth in front of his face. And he's like, and he makes him think that it's a year ago, the night of the murder. And he's like, tell me about it. Tell me what happened. And he kind of gets him to relive the experience. And so they link up with the Sir Carol lookalike, the father lookalike, and they take it through the whole thing. They have the conversation that they had the night he died. And then we see him, and everyone is like watching around the corner, like secretly watching, including Detective Newman. And so we see the Baron drug his Sir Carol, who he believes to be Sir Carol's wine, I think it is, that he's drinking. And then they do a little switcheroo where they give him an untainted drink because they see that he has, and this is another thing where like why did he have, like, they would have had to plant a bottle on his person or something like that. So anyway, they switch out the drinks so that he can drink the drink without actually poisoning himself. And then in what I thought was like fairly convincing, he pretends to pass out and lose consciousness. And then they see, and this was where I was starting to wonder, like, they can't just watch him. Like, when are they going to step in? Because then the Baron goes in with, like, a knife or some sort of sharp implement, and he's about to, like, make the punctures in the neck. And then Newman comes out from nowhere, and Zelen is, like, wakes him up from the hypnosis. And Newman is like, "You're under arrest for murder."
Gotcha.
Yeah, exactly. Gotcha. And he essentially it's revealed that he did this to get Irina. Like, he had planned to marry Irina. And the reason that he killed Carol was because they were having like a late night drink together, and Carol was like, Irina is engaged to be married to Fedor. And the Baron is like, Irina was supposed to be mine. Yeah, very gross.
Yeah.
And Sir Carol is like, that's weird. No. So then he kills him. And
a reasonable reaction.
Yeah, of course, totally.
Such news.
But in some ways it did work because Irina did move in with him, and he did become her guardian. So like, we can only imagine what he would have done to Fedor.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, so because that was probably going to be his next thing.
Fedor never stood a chance. So
Fedor did never stand a chance. He's so lucky he made it through the whole film.
Yeah.
So, yes. So then they arrest him, and we get this wrap-up kind of moment where, what I think Irina or something is like, well, how did, like, he, like, yes, he poisoned him and he made the puncture wounds, but, like, how did he get all of the blood out? And he was like, oh, well, like, we stopped him right before he did it, but he was going to do something called blood cupping, to, like, suck all of the blood out of the body. It's like a legitimate technique. It's called cupping therapy. Yeah, so it's a traditional Chinese and Middle Eastern practice that involves placing cups on different like points of the body and creating suction. And so I've done this. It feels amazing. It's like getting a massage from the inside.
Okay, yeah, because I've seen it in movies, but I was never quite sure what it was, and it always, I don't know, I guess it looked kind of painful, but it sounds like...
So traditionally, the way that it's done is that you have like a glass cup that's like almost perfectly circular. So it's less sort of like a thing you would drink out of. It's like fully round, except for like the flat surface where it meets the skin. And you light something like a cotton ball on fire and you swirl it around in the cup and then quickly apply it to the skin. And because you've burned, because that fire has consumed all of the oxygen, a vacuum is created and suction is formed against your skin. And so if you've ever seen photos or videos of athletes like working out, or like partially clothed, and they have these weird kind of bruises that almost look like sucker marks, like from a giant octopus, where there's these perfectly circular bruises. Those are cupping marks. And so blood cupping specifically refers to a technique where you make a small incision in the skin right before you apply the cup. And so then suction is created, and blood kind of is pulled out. And so that's kind of what that technique is. So blood cupping is a real thing. You can do it, and cupping is something that was like a very legitimate kind of like physical therapy thing that many people use. And now you can do it without fire, where you can get cups that have a little like nozzle at the end, and you attach this like handle that like manually pumps it, so you don't have to do it with like a little burning cotton ball, the way you would in the past. So but the thing that they get wrong is that you cannot drain a body this way. Like, you just can't. And it would also leave a massive cupping bruise. So it's a little bit like, but they're assuming that no one knows what that is, you know?
Yeah, he wasn't as, he didn't pre-plan the way Dr. Otto did in the vampire vat.
Yes, exactly.
Just
Anyway.
drain him the old-fashioned way.
Yes, and that was another little bit of a tangent, but I just figured if anyone watches this film and they're like, what is cupping? Like, that's an explanation. It is a real technique that you can really do. I've had it done by a massage therapist. It feels really good. It has a lot of real benefits, so don't let this movie make you think that it's like just a weird murder technique. But just, I just think that was like an unexpected, and I get that they were trying to be creative. I think it is a really creative explanation for how you would drain a body of blood through only 2 small puncture wounds. Right. But then we get to the final moment of the film, and I would say that this is probably the most famous moment. All of the actors, the guy who played her father, and then Lugosi, and then who's the Layla Bennett? Carol Borland, who plays Lugosi, Borland, and then I guess Holmes Herbert, or no, James Bradbury Jr. is the third vampire. They're all packing their stuff up. Luna is taking off her makeup, and Lugosi claimed, it gives this line where he says, "This vampire business, it has given me a great idea for a new act. Luna, in the new act, I will be the vampire. Did you watch me? I gave all of me. I was greater than any real vampire." And Luna just kind of rolls her eyes at him. Yeah. And then the film ends.
Little bit of meta commentary there on
yes.
Bela.
Very, very meta.
Very meta, and we also get a similar kind of ending to that's akin to the vampire bat, where it's like we've had all the seriousness before, quote unquote seriousness beforehand, and then it ends with this kind of tonally dissonant comedic, like we need to end with some levity. So
yeah, it's a good parallel.
Yeah, so wow. What a twist. That
what
makes
a twist.
No sense
makes
whatsoever.
No sense.
Okay,
yeah.
So yes, please tell me more about, I guess, because it sounds like you have some tea about how the actors felt with this decision.
Let's
and
dish.
all of that. Yes, please.
They hated it.
I kind of don't blame them.
Yeah, the actors thought it was very silly. They didn't like it. Yeah, but in terms of, and yeah, even for the time, the line that Lugosi gives is pretty meta, because at that point he was really known for playing Dracula, and that line has really only become more true as the decades have gone by. Because, like I would say that Lugosi's name is fairly synonymous with the fictional character of Dracula, and by extension synonymous with the vampire film. and that people, myself included, know basically nothing about him except that he played Dracula. So there is something sort of prophetic in a way where, like, he says, I gave all of me, and it's like, yeah, his legacy has been completely subsumed by Dracula.
Yes.
And by the fictional IP of the the intellectual property of Dracula. But yeah, so I mean, I guess starting with the basics of, our impressions of this film, is this a vampire movie?
Yeah, it's hard because I know we had this discussion for the Vampire Bat
Yes,
where,
we did.
again, similarly, kind of a twist where it's like, oh, there's no vampires. So I know for that I leaned more towards the side of no, because I argued the film was kind of just using the vampire genre as a Trojan horse for the mad scientist film. With this one, I'm more inclined to say yes. I would still call it a vampire film, solely like for the fact that there's like in terms of how I forget the actress's name who plays the female vampire. It is
Carol Borland.
yes, Carol Borland. I feel like her look was so iconic and her performance very memorable that it did become influential, I feel like, in terms of how later female vampires were depicted on screen. So, I mean, that's kind of showing how, regardless of whether the film had an actual vampire in it or not, its fingerprints are still seen on subsequent depictions of actual female vampires in film. So I guess in terms of how it's contributed to the legacy, I would say yes. And yeah, that would be kind of my main argument.
Yeah, I think that's a very sound argument. Last week I said that I thought The Vampire Bat was a vampire movie.
Yeah.
I mostly said that because I thought that because this film, I think, makes that, I was like, we're gonna have an even more interesting conversation.
Yeah.
To be honest, I would kind of agree with you. I think that this is more of a vampire film than The Vampire Bat was, because for this we have scenes where, like, you see people turned into bats, and you see bats turn into people, and there's feeding, where someone feeds on another person to drink their blood, or at least there's scenes where, like, you're led to believe that that's what's happening. So I do think that this is more of a vampire film. But in terms of its contemporary reception and how audiences felt about it at the time, it grossed $54,000, which is $1.2 million in today's money. I wasn't able to find a budget for the film, though, so it's really hard for me to say how financially successful it was, because, obviously, like, how much you make in the box office is really not helpful information if you don't know how much the film costs to make to begin with.
Right.
So, like, if you, like, for example, Black Panther grossed over $1 billion, but if they made Black Panther for $900 million, then it would have been a massive failure, but they made it for less than 300 million. So
if it had Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power budget.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So the actors did not like the twist, but audiences did. It worked for audiences. It was received largely positively by viewers and critics, though there is one outlier, and this is a long quote, but it is so amazing that I will read it in full. A very angry letter was written to the New York Times by a doctor. Okay, so here goes. This is amazing. Quote, a dozen of the worst obscene pictures cannot equal the damage that is done by films such as The Mark of the Vampire. I do not refer to the senselessness of the picture. I do not even refer to the effect in spreading and fostering the most obnoxious superstitions. I refer to the terrible effect that it has on the mental and nervous systems of not only unstable, but even normal men, women, and children. I am not speaking in the abstract. I am basing myself on facts. Several people have come to my notice who, after seeing that horrible picture, suffered nervous shock, were attacked with insomnia, and those who did fall asleep were tortured by the most horrible nightmares. In my opinion, it is a crime to produce and to present such films. We must guard not only our people's morals, we must be as careful with their physical and mental health.
Wow.
Wow.
Wow. One of the reviews of all time.
Yeah. I mean,
that is an angry film goer. That
yes.
um,
Devoted to his patients, though.
clearly, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, who knows how hyperbolic he's being there, but yeah, it's interesting to read things like that and remember, for as, dated and silly as these films seem today, they were not in the 30s.
This was all new. This was all brand
All
new.
new. It was all brand new, and things like people turning into bats, drinking blood. It's like, yeah, that was disturbing. That was scary, and
Hypnosis as a concept,
hypnosis,
I'm guessing.
yeah, like supernatural, the occult, things like that. That is so interesting. Where did you find that?
That is specifically from a book titled Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, The Expanded Story of a Haunting Collaboration, with a complete filmography of their films together.
Oh, very nice.
Yes, and the letter was written by William J. Robinson to the New York Times, and it was dated the 28th of July, 1935. Yeah,
Well,
so...
that's a really cool find, and it's interesting how you said the actors hated the ending of this film, but audiences loved it, and how also some critics consider this film to almost be a satire. And it makes me wonder, think about the cycle of vampire films and popularity, and how I feel like every time there's kind of a resurgence in the popularity of vampire media, there inevitably comes okay, now we can start satirizing and making fun of it.
Yes.
So I wonder if this movie, it's 1935, Nosferatu came out in 27, I believe, and, Dracula in 31 kind of kicked off this trend in Hollywood. So I wonder if we're coming to that first end point in the cycle of vampire popularity where it's like, okay, this is such an oversaturated genre, we can start making fun of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's because the films were produced at such a rate. And at this point, it wasn't just Dracula. We also had some of the other big monster movies.
That's true. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because we've been trying to cover every one, and there only have been a few.
We're trying.
Yes. So I think another reason that I wanted to bring up this review is that because it just shows how the times change. Because if this letter was written about a horror film today, they would have this everywhere. This would be on the back of the DVD. This would be on the website. This would be quoted in the trailer. This is exactly the kind of marketing that horror films want these days. If you think about when The Exorcist came out, a lot of the promotion and the trailers mentioned people passed out in the screenings. So ambulances had to be stationed outside of movie theaters that were showing The Exorcist. And Paranormal Activity, a lot of the trailers for those films would include night vision footage of audiences reacting to the film, so screaming and stuff like that. And I also have read critics' reviews of Lars von Trier screenings at film festivals where they'll mention people stormed out because of how disturbing the film was. So those things today are worn as like badges of honor by horror films.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's another really interesting cultural shift.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. So
Yeah, but in terms of its reception and what we, what we were talking about earlier, the tease from earlier about the relationship between this film and London After Midnight. London After Midnight was another film directed by Tob Browning, and that film was released in 1927. It was a near identical plot. So it's described as this is the basic plot for London After Midnight. Roger Balfour is found dead in his London home. Burke, a representative of Scotland Yard, after questioning everyone present, declares the death a suicide, despite objection from Balfour's neighbor and close friend. 5 years later, the Hamlin residents witness strange lights within the now forsaken mansion before realizing the new tenants to be two vampiric figures of a man with a beaver felt top hat, long hair and sharp teeth, and a silent pale woman wearing long robes. So a similar kind of thing of like a series of violent attacks happens, and then it turns out that the vampires are not vampires and that they are in fact actors who have been hired to ferret out this ruse. And for a similar reason, there's a man who wanted to marry this guy's daughter, and that wasn't going to happen, so he killed him so that he could kind of try to make that happen on his own. But what's most significant about this film is that it has been completely lost to time. The last known copy of the film was destroyed in the 1965 MGM vault fire. And so this film is like highly sought after because of that. And one thing that's pretty cool is that in 2002, Turner Classic Movies aired a reconstructed version produced by Richard Schmidlin, using the original script and numerous film stills. So he used like hundreds of stills.
wow.
And also the script, and there was also, scoring done by an orchestra. And so, and that, you can't really access the reconstructed version. That was like a special screening. I think there was like a museum exhibit. But I looked into like where you can find that reconstruction, and I don't think that we would like have I don't think we'd be able to readily access that. But yeah, I mean, it's it's interesting that this is a director remaking his own work.
Yes. And also, quick fun fact, but the actor who played the vampire in London After Midnight was none other than Lon Chaney, who was the first choice to play Dracula in the 1931 film before he passed, I believe.
Yes.
So
it's a small world.
a small world, and we, now you know that Lon Chaney did in fact play a vampire in his time.
He made it happen.
He made it happen. He's like, I played Quasimodo, I played the Phantom of the Opera, I gotta do vampire.
Yeah, but it's interesting that this film is really famous for being a remake of another film that we can no longer access. And
yeah, so
yeah.
in a way that makes it an original, at least for us, because, well, we have nothing to compare it to, but it's, that is interesting. And yeah.
It's also interesting in terms of this idea of iterative work, because this was something that came up with Vampire, because the guy, he showed so many cuts of it. He showed it under different titles. It kind of had multiple lives where it had its release, and oh god, he was like chased out of the theater or something, and then and then it kind of had a life on the circus kind of circuit,
Yeah, it's kind of almost like I get the sense it was like it's called like House of Horrors or
Yes,
House
yeah.
of Hell, and it's like sort of was repackaged as like this B horror film.
Yes.
Strangely, um, yeah. So
Yeah.
it's
So this idea of, because we don't really have that happen nowadays. Like directors really wait until they can do it the way that I mean, if you're powerful enough to do that, you'll sit on an idea for a long time until you can do it right. But like audiences, I just don't think are receptive to that idea of like, oh yeah, we'll give you another shot. We'll buy a ticket to the same movie again 4 years later. Um,
mm-hmm.
or I guess it would have been more than 4 years, but closer to 7 years, I think. So yeah, and just also this idea of like the sedimentary nature of a subgenre like this, where there are so many similarities across these films to the degree that it's
Mm-hmm.
like hard to keep them straight at times.
Yeah.
But other kinds of behind the scenes stuff. Another fun fact is that you have talked a lot about Luna and the character of Luna and the kind of standard that she set in terms of her look and just the future women vampires that we see. Her costume was designed by Adrian, just Adrian. He was the same designer who worked on The Wizard of Oz.
Ooh.
Yes, he was deeply, deeply famous. So famous that he was just like a monomer, kind of, no last
Yeah.
name necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone knew who Adrian was. And this costume set the standard for future female vampire characters.
Yes, I knew it.
Yeah.
I love that so much.
Yeah, and it's also very cool that they got such a famous person
Yeah.
to do this. And it
It
also just is a statement on how important costume design is.
Yes, absolutely. I yeah, I feel like a costume design is an underappreciated
Yeah.
area in filmmaking, but yeah, it's so important, and that's really cool. I always kind of like seeing how big names appear in films that are,
Hmm.
outside of their typical genre or just one that they wouldn't be in because it's not as big, high budget or prestige. Like, for instance, I remember I was watching The Holiday, the cute little Christmas movie with Cameron Diaz and Kate Winslet, and it just said music by Hans Zimmer, and I was like, "Excuse me."
Hans, he's everywhere.
Including your Nora Ephron or Nancy Meyer, one of the two, romantic comedies. So,
Yes. Oh, okay. I'm we're like jumping around a bit because I just remembered other things, some other interesting things
mm-hmm.
about well, but you correctly identified that this was an iconic look that went on to define the way that we did these characters for a
Mm-hmm.
while to come. And like you're saying, those traces still remain. Like
Oh yeah,
even up to, like what we do in the shadows. We
yeah,
still have long, dark
black,
haired,
yeah,
very pale, bold makeup, kind of
mm-hmm.
long gowns, like, female vampires that look that way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but kind of other sort of story details that I thought were interesting. We talked a bit about some of the like subtext, especially in that moment where Rena gets down on her knees, and which is even more interesting to think about when you realize that she wasn't actually hypnotized. She was just kind of doing that.
Yeah,
That was unscripted. So when some of the historical stuff we have about this film, the runtime was listed as being 80 minutes, but the film is actually only 60 minutes. Um,
mm.
so it's estimated that, but then some people say that was a typo. So at least 10 minutes of footage was cut from this film, possibly 20.
Ooh,
And there are some theories about this. So some people believe that, yes, this was based on London After Midnight, but that some subplots were added. And so at the very beginning, we talked about that wound on Lugosi's temple, where he has this really noticeable, like, blood splatter on his temple that never gets explained. Some people believe that that was a subplot in which it's revealed or implied that that character had an incestuous relationship with Luna, and that he killed himself out of guilt by shooting himself in the head, and that
Holy
is how he
shit.
yes and that is how he yes and that's how he became a
Jesus.
vampire. And so at the time, this would have been completely, as I'm sure you
Yeah,
know,
no.
completely unacceptable. No way in
no.
hell.
At least not in any explicit way.
Yes. So people think that that there might have been some implications of that within the story, and that even those were considered too extreme and they were removed from the film, which is something that you've brought up and that we've talked about in the past as well, as studios, like you've talked about, like some screams being cut, and from Dracula, I believe, and
Yes.
like some removing some shots where, like, a murder happens, or other kinds of violence like that.
Yeah.
So that was one theory about it. And let me see if there are other kinds of theories about that blood mark, because some people contest that, yes. So yeah, so some people think that maybe the suicide thing was true, but not the incest thing, or there's some disagreement there. But it seems clear that there was some sort of subplot that explained the wound on the Lugosi character's forehead, and that was removed because of the code and because of standards at the time.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Do you believe that would have been part of it?
I mean, I'm kind of inclined to at least believe his character's backstory would have involved possibly suicide, just given the position of the wound and how it's on the temple.
Yeah.
So yes, I could see that being a part of the character's backstory, and for obvious reasons that would have been cut. The incestuous relationship with his daughter. I don't know. I'm curious where that theory came from. If it was like from actual onset, or like people who were there during like
Yeah.
the filmmaking or screenwriting. So yeah, hard to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, I actually thought you were going to say that some of the footage they cut was due to possibly there being too much of a queer or homoerotic undertone with the Luna, or who's the female vampire? Was it Luna?
Luna, yeah, it's Irina and Luna.
With Irina and Luna, which I could also see them doing as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So so I'm seeing who has alleged it. So film historian Gregory William Mank says that the alleged incest subplot was never in the shooting script and never filmed, though he acknowledges that it was likely hinted at in the original scenario, like the treatment written by the scriptwriter Guy and Endore.
Okay.
And this is backed up by Borland, who plays Luna in the film.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So, okay, all right, I'm more inclined to believe it now. It sounds like the series relatively substantiated. So was this when the film was still going to have the "it was all a ruse" at the end? Because
Yeah.
wow, that is like some actor method, deep character. Like
Yeah, actually,
Bela had his actor's journal and was like writing the
yeah.
whole history of his character.
Yeah, this raises some okay, because it goes on to say Lugosi biographer Arthur Lenig asserts that Endor did originally intend an incest backstory, but that it was removed by the studio before the shooting script was written. Though he goes on to claim that a cut line of dialogue indicates that Count Mora, oh, he has had a name the whole time, Count Mora shot himself after strangling his daughter. So you're right that this raises, and I mean this is like what this film is really like, it raises the question of like when the
Mm-hmm.
whole they're actors pretending to be vampires idea was introduced.
Yeah, and I could see that happening possibly when Todd Browning was brought on because it sounds like it was written. There's a different screenwriter.
Hmm.
Todd Browning did not write this, so probably in the original screenplay or pitch, this was not supposed to be a oh, and it was all just a ruse. But maybe when Todd Browning got the script, he was like, hey, maybe I could kind of just make this into a London After Midnight remake.
Yeah, so there and I don't have, I don't have like the full timeline on who was brought in when, and
Mm-hmm.
all of those things, because that really varies movie to movie. And this was kind of like the studio system. Like films were just
Mm-hmm.
made, and like the creative aspects of making a film were just done so differently than they are now.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to tell, because I would, especially because so many people have backed this up, and there is something to the way that Count Mora watches Luna in the film.
Yeah.
I do believe that there could have been an incest kind of subplot there, like that moment where he watches her feed on Irina. Like, there does seem to be some sort of like, his satisfaction seems so deep that it feels
Mm-hmm.
erotic on a level. So,
Yes, I agree with that. And like again, like you said, the actors didn't know the ending,
mhm.
so you have to take like at all those scenes. These actors are playing it straight. Like Bela
Yes.
believes he's playing a vampire, and that's his vampire daughter. So
Yeah.
I have to believe that that it certainly influenced his choices. And like you said, he's watching in a very, kind of satisfied or like titillated kind of way.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
there is an erotic component.
Yeah, and they have the way they move their bodies so similarly. Like they touch each other sometimes, like not weirdly, but they have physical
Yeah.
contact. So, and also like the way that Luna watches Arena through her window and stuff, like there is an eroticism there,
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Right.
So yeah, and I mean, I think that those were a lot of the things that,
Mm-hmm.
um unless we wanted to talk more about the fire,
The
we
fire?
could talk about the fire, the
What's the
MGM
fire?
the MGM vault fire of
Elliot.
1965.
Oh my goodness. Please tell us about the 1965 fire at MGM.
Yes. So is this is, as we mentioned, that this film is kind of, maybe a kind of silent remake of, not literally silent, but like an unacknowledged remake of the film London After Midnight, which was lost forever in a fire, specifically the MGM Vault Fire of 1965, which happened on August 10th. And so basically, like, the story of that is that um, MGM had like a big lot, as big studios still do. So an electrical short ignited a fire in Vault 7 of Lot 3 on MGM's back lot located in Culver City. And
Mm-hmm.
so the vaults were essentially concrete bunkers, with no windows. And
Mm.
so each vault had a small fan at the top, and that was the only ventilation.
Oh.
There were no sprinkler systems. And so I think because the assumption was just, what do we need that for? There's just stuff in there. And so, but it does feel, because film was so famously flammable, it does seem.
Yes, well, it was made of celluloid film, so
Yeah, I think we would have been at the celluloid point. We probably weren't doing like silver nitrate anymore.
yeah, I think it was the silver nitrate one that has like a guaranteed expiration date of 100 years, I think. So
Uh-huh.
it's like any films made on silver
Yes.
nitrate.
Well, I guess just for people who are interested, I figured we could talk about this just because people might not know about, because we're in this early film period. I figured it would be interesting to talk about just from we are doing, this is a kind of archival project. Archival work is something that is relevant to every art field, and it has a really interesting role to play in the world of film, because you might think, oh, well, the film as a technology is less than 130 years old. What do we need to archive? Well, a lot,
Yeah.
because film stock is very unstable, because it was, meant to chemically react to light. So, a common statistic that we hear is that we've lost 90% of early film. We've lost 90% of silent film. And I did not know this until pretty recently, but one of the big reasons that that's the case is that at the time this was a lowbrow art. Film was at the beginning, film was lowbrow. It was something that poor people who couldn't afford to go to the theater did. And we didn't perceive films as having really any long-term cultural value. So as soon as a film was done with its theatrical run, it was burned. And you can see photos of people burning massive bins of film, just dumping reels, hundreds and hundreds of feet of film, which is so shocking to imagine today. It's chilling to picture someone burning thousands of feet of film stock that, partially because of how expensive it is. But film is also really difficult to preserve. And so, you really need it to be in a temperature controlled, humidity controlled, lightless environment. So this vault fire is actually one of several significant vault fires that have happened at film studios in America. But it's really sad. Everything in the vault was lost. They had multiple vaults. This is Vault 7 of more than 7. And the explosion did kill one person, and it destroyed hundreds of films, and many of them it was the only copy.
Yeah.
So in addition to, loss from the historical record, someone also died, which is really terrible as well.
Yes.
Yeah, but one thing that I think is interesting is that MGM, in relation to this whole idea of films not preserving their work, MGM at the time was one of the only studios that kept a vault of its work at all. Because at the time it was the custom to destroy things. So it's really sad that MGM was going to the unique effort of holding on to things, and they still, due to lack of OSHA protections, they still had this accident, which is so the story of the film industry, that safety corners are cut, that assumptions are made about things that could and will or won't go wrong. But yeah, so the severity, so the building was destroyed. There was a big explosion. There was this fire. It took a while to put out. But MGM did retain 68% of its catalog. But that's still a big loss. They still lost quite a lot of stuff. And similar fires have occurred. So a couple decades beforehand, Fox had a vault fire in 1937, and then Universal Studios had a fire in 2008 that also destroyed an attraction at their amusement park. But that fault fire also lost a lot of masters of music. So there was a lot of music affected by that fault fire as well. Yeah.
Well,
So,
thank
yeah.
you. No, thank you so much for just like sharing this very important history, and that shouldn't be forgotten. And it's like, not to sound dramatic when I say that or anything, but I think film history, or film as a medium, we forget how much of a kind of baby genre it is.
Yeah.
And so within the context of what you've just described from like a historical perspective, when a new medium is introduced, like you don't know necessarily like what it will evolve into. So the fact that they're just like burning all of these
Yeah.
reels of film just kind of shows, reflects the regard that film was held in at the time, and now it's one of the most profitable and successful mediums in all of human history.
Yes. Yeah, and it's like, it does sound a bit dramatic, but I think it's heartbreaking to,
Yeah.
that we have so little of the earliest days of, it's sort of like if you were a parent, like burning all of your kids like
Yeah.
drawings.
And I mean, like, we have to construct our understanding of film history and film as a media from like what scraps we have.
Yeah, it's true. And so much of the work that film historians do is going through playbills, going through newspapers for
Yeah,
the
reviews.
advertisements, the reviews, records, financial records kept by studios. There are so many silent films where all we have is the title of the film and the director and maybe someone who
Yep.
starred in it. And so it's, it's sort of like a kind of picture like a whole wing of the Louvre burning down, like
Yeah.
that would be a real loss. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's like, and maybe these films weren't, like Oppenheimer or, some other, some really, really high concept, really fancy films. But like you're saying, film and television is the primary medium through which people experience storytelling in this day and age. Like, people are not reading books the way they used to. They're not going to movie theaters the way they used to. So the fact that we have so little record of the origins of this deeply powerful art form is sad, especially when you think about, like, one thing that I think about a lot when I think about why I love to study film is just how young it is. Like, this podcast, we're doing like 127 years, like we're starting from 127 years in the past. When you think about how old something like painting is, we have paintings that are hundreds of, like thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. We have pottery that is millennia old, so to think that we have, like, I mean, and knock on wood about how long humanity will be around just with the way the planet is looking. But, like, you think about 1,000 years from now, like, what are we going to have of film and television the way that we have of paintings and pottery and music and other art forms today from so long ago? We are at the explosive inception of an art form, and it's really incredible to think like things have changed so much in comparatively such a small amount of time.
I'm softly clapping right now. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
And I'm glad you could give such an impassioned speech in the context of The Mark of the Vampire.
It is. Mark of the Vampire doesn't deserve my speech about the beauty of this art form and the legacy of film.
But maybe it does.
Yeah, I mean that kind of is what we're saying here is that
Yeah.
it all matters. It all
It
is
that's true.
important.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this was
Um
maybe a silly little film, but people put
yeah,
like their blood, sweat, and tears into this, the same as
they did.
Oppenheimer.
That very true. Um all right, so I guess we can probably wrap up here. Did we have any other final thoughts?
I think we've identified a favorite moment from each film.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you want to identify your favorite moment.
Definitely the first time we see the Count and his daughter, um, and they're in the castle, and she's like slowly walking down the stairs, and we see the cobweb. I
Hmm.
just love the atmosphere of it, and
Hmm.
thought it was really great.
Yes, I think that's a good one to choose. Um, yeah, you like cobwebs. There's been a few
I
times
did.
that you've been like, the cobwebs were hitting.
Well, they're so big in these movies. It's like Party City, huge
Yes,
cobwebs everywhere.
yes, the fantasy, the glamour.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, go big or go home.
Listen. Hmm.
I think that I think that there were a lot of moments that stood out to me. I think I'm
Hmm.
gonna be silly this time because I think for the past I've been like, this beautiful shot
Yeah.
touched me. I'm
Yeah.
gonna say when they shot at the bat. When they tried to kill a bat with a gun.
That's a great one.
Yes.
Well, all right. So
Yeah.
that was The Mark
Yes.
of the Vampire.
Thank you for listening to another episode of This Podcast Sucks.
Find us where you get your podcasts on Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Follow us on social media and give us a like.
You can find us at That Vampire Pod on Twitter and Instagram. We'd love to hear from you guys. And remember, stay bloodthirsty.
Catch our next episode on Frank Streyer's Condemned to Live.